Fáilte, and welcome back to Undercover Irish with your host Olin. If the first one took a long time, the second one took a little bit of a shorter time, so a little bit of problems with microphones here and there, but we've got a brand new one here, so you might let me know if this microphone sounds okay. And let's get straight into it. In our first episode, we looked at mainly at language, at the importance of the Irish language, just taking one aspect of it. In this episode, what we want to do is take a story from today and map our way back and discover, I suppose, the real history. This is Undercover Irish, so we like to go under the cover of the stories of today as well. And in a very funny or strange way, we're going to use a song as a reference point, almost like in a lecture you'd use a textbook. We're going to use a song to travel back in time. So without further ado, Araigling.
The Emerald Isle has an ecological problem of apocalyptic proportions. A toxic blue-green algae now poisoning Lough Neagh.
Okay, Accorda, let's jump straight in. In the last number of years, a story that's taken my interest and seems to pop up every summer is the ongoing destruction at Lough Neagh, the ongoing kind of environmental crisis. So every summer in the last number of years, stories have appeared in the newspapers, in the media, on the television, and in some cases it's gone worldwide about the pollution that appears on the lake, on Lough Neagh, every single year. So Lough Neagh is Ireland's largest lake, and we'll get into the importance of it in just a second. But for me, looking at it, it's not necessarily what's said, but maybe what's unsaid and what's omitted that I find interesting. And this will be the basis of today's podcast. But basically, the story goes as in the media as such, as this. Every year there's an algae which appears. It is damaging the environment. It's leading to a crisis, an ecological crisis, and you do not need to be an environmentalist to see this. Look up the media, look up the reports, and look at the algae, and you can see that the loch is dying on its feet. And in today's episode, we're going to go undercover. We're going to go under the cover of the current crisis. We're going to use an unorthodox guide to exploring and uncovering the history and the stories that are omitted from the current affairs explanation. And along the way, we're going to look at Lough Neagh's mythological origin story. We're going to look at how the lake, the loch, links Ireland with the Isle of Man, with Wales, and even Brittany. And hopefully we'll emerge with a deeper understanding of the importance of not just Lough Neagh, but the natural features on our landscape and the history and the myths that accompany them and the importance of them as well. So to begin with any natural feature, it's really important to begin with the name. And the name of an ecological feature, a physical feature within the landscape, is often the expression of the story of that place. And often that story can project a particular power, particularly in places where colonization or imperialism has happened. So think for a second how audacious it is that the second largest freshwater lake in the world was named after Queen Victoria, Lake Victoria, despite the fact that the surrounding areas, English wasn't the spoken language and had its own culture for thousands of years. Imagine how audacious it is that the most sacred space for Aboriginal Australians was for so long attempted to be named at least Ayers Rock, despite the fact that Uluru is its natural name. And imagine how unusual it is and wrong it is for the largest mountain on earth to be named Everest after a British explorer, despite the fact that the original name in the native language has a meaning goddess mother of the world. And this was known at the time, and it's much more accurate and apt. So despite Lough Neagh being anglicised in name, a sign of colonisation in Ireland, at least we should be thankful that that's as far as it went. Because Lough Neagh survived the plantation of Ulster. At the time, the British made efforts to name the loch Lough Sydney. And then, when that didn't work, Lough Chichester. These were Lord Deputies of Ireland. So the British were trying to name Ireland's largest lake in their honour. Obviously, the names didn't survive, and Lough Neagh as an anglicisation survived. Now, this means that we have access to move back through our own native language to figure out the origin name of the lake, the origin story, if you like, the powerful part of that. So Lough Neagh Oscuelga is Lough Neathach, and it's interesting, just segue for a second. Lough, meaning lake, survives not just in Ireland but in Scotland as well, a sister language of Gaelga. And Lough Neathach is the original name of Lough Neagh. It was named in honour of Óchig or Ócach, and this brings us right back to the ancient Irish mythology, the Dagda. The Dagda is considered the great god of Irish mythology, predating Christianity. He was the chief god of the Tuatha Dé Danann, and the Dagda was portrayed as a father figure, a king, a druid. And Ócach or Óchig, who Lough Neagh is named after, Lough Neathach, was a kind of a representation of that god, often in horse form, but a representation of the ancient gods that the original Irish would have and the Celts would have worshipped prior to Christianity. It's a small but important victory over the colonization attempt, that the name and the myths and the stories live on and we can trace them back, resisting attempts to erase them. And we'll see that the myth of Ócach or Óchig will reappear later on as we explore a song that guides our journey in trying to understand Lough Neagh deeper. Okay, so I've always been struck by the possibility of reading a way back through history using a song or a ballad. You know, often you hear these songs, ballads, of course, are storytelling ways or ways of storytelling through music. And there's a quote by Frank Hart that says, "Those in power write history, while those who suffer write the songs." So if we take that onto and expand it, basically, I think we've been left with all of these ballads and all these songs, which in a very short space of time, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, can tell a story which is very complex, which is very broad. And because their stories are not academic pieces, they have the ability to tap into emotion and feeling and the perspective of ordinary people as well. And when I saw the pollution at Lough Neagh, one of the first things that came to my mind was a song that's called Let Erin Remember. And the reason why this song came to mind is because of the second verse, which overtly names Lough Neagh and speaks about it. But it's a very good one to explore in this context, because what we're trying to figure out is, how has Lough Neathach, how has it ended up in the position that it's in today? So this song was collected by Thomas Moore, famous for Moore's Melody. So he would have been going around Ireland in the 19th century, and he would have been collecting songs and writing songs himself. He'd add the lyrics himself. And some of the songs he was famous for would have been The Last Rose of Summer, The Minstrel Boy, and of course Let Erin Remember itself. And to give you, I suppose, an idea of the importance of the song and the importance of Moore's works, this song at one stage was supposed to have been reputed to have been a potential Irish national anthem. It's a song that was played in the Olympics in 1924 prior to Uluru Navíon being adopted by the Irish state or the Free State. And at Terence MacSweeney's funeral, it was played as Terence MacSweeney was being laid to rest. So this is a song that was held in high regard by Irish people back in the day. And the first verse goes as following: "Let Erin remember the days of old, ere her faithless sons betrayed her, when Malachy wore the collar of gold, which he won from the proud invader. When our kings with standards of green unfurled, led the red branch knights to danger, ere the emerald gem of the western world was set in the crown of a stranger." So it's extremely powerful. It's extremely powerful in its claims, and it shows what a powerful lyricist Thomas Moore was. And in the first verse, he talks about Ireland being betrayed. He discusses Malachy winning the collar of gold from the invader, and that references Malachy Muel Shocknell, an Irish king who defeated a Viking invader and took from him a collar of gold. Mentions the Red Branch Knights, who in mythology had their headquarters somewhere around Armagh today, the present day, which is close enough to Lough Neagh. And it ends up kind of saying, like, don't let the emerald gem of the Western world be set in the crown of a stranger. And even though that first verse is, gives us a context in terms of, Moore is trying to talk at a time when Ireland is you know, under the Act of Union, and the famine is occurring in the 19th century. But there's this generation of people like Moore who are setting out to save Irish nationhood, Irish culture, whether it's subsequently through the GA, the National Games in 1884, whether it's Conran na Gaeilge, the Gaelic League, trying to save the language. And Moore, in his songs, he's trying to save the idea of Irish nationhood, Ireland as a nation. And to do that, he's kind of, first one there of Let Erin Remember, he is packaging up all of these images of nationhood and putting them in song for subsequent generations. But it's the second verse which I find extremely relevant to today's topic. Now, at this point, we need to go back to the start a little bit. So I spoke at the start about the reporting on the crisis at Lough Neagh, at Lough Neathach, and I spoke about what was omitted. Now, to be fair, not all media omitted the following fact, but one of the first things that you would come to mind when a building or a place or an area is under threat is, well, who's the owner? Who is in charge and who's responsible? And it might seem to you and me that the idea that someone might own a lake or a mountain, for that matter, or a river, that one person could own that, geological feature would be crazy. But in actual fact, officially, in terms of the law, in inverted commas, the owner of Lough Neagh is known as the Earl of Shaftesbury. The Earl of Shaftesbury. His real name, of course, is Nick Ashley Cooper. And while not all media have omitted his mention in the reporting of it, what I do find unusual is when he is mentioned, he's mentioned as a saviour or a potential saviour, and that's quite literally. So there's an article here, could Lough Neagh's aristocratic owner be its saviour? So when the owner is brought forward, he's presented quite literally as a saviour. Another newspaper article says, Earl of Shaftesbury open to Lough Neagh sale, but won't give it away. So this guy will not give it away. Omitted, of course, is how he came into ownership. So it doesn't take a genius to realise that this is the descendant of people who, I suppose what they would say is, acquired the ownership of Lough Neagh during the Ulster plantations, during the colonisation of Ireland. And it's an unusual thing to say that Lough Neagh, Lough Neathach, officially is owned by the Earl of Shaftesbury. So this guy owns the soil, the bed. He made attempts in a previous generation, or a previous Earl of Shaftesbury made attempt to lay claim to all of the waters within Lough Neagh, but was unsuccessful. But at present, he is the owner of the bed, the soil of Lough Neagh. Now, when I said that the song Let Erin Remember was what came to my mind when I saw, the pollution at Lough Neagh and the story in the media, it was primarily because of the second verse of that song. On Lough Neagh's banks as the fisherman strays, when the clear cold leaves declining, he sees the round towers of other days and the waves beneath him shining. Thus shall memory often in dream sublime catch a glimpse of the days that are over, thus sighing look through the waves of time for the long faded glories they cover. And that's the end of the song, right? And Moore is saying in this second verse, he's using Lough Neagh as he's using the fisherman, looking down through the waves of time. It's kind of like a metaphor for Ireland in the 19th century, under the Act of Union, under British rule, enduring colonisation, imperialism, the penal laws, and all of these things. And the fisherman in this case is looking down through the waves for the long faded glories they cover. Now, in researching this, I've deepened my own understanding of it, but my initial kind of understanding of that verse was that when he was looking down through the waves to the round towers, anyone who's a passing interest in Irish history will know about the round towers. And basically, these were towers that were set up or built when the Vikings invaded Ireland and the Norse invaded Ireland. So the Vikings used the rivers of Ireland kind of to pillage and plunder initially. They used them as highways up through into the centre of Ireland. And At the time, there would have been a lot of riches in the monasteries, and basically, as time went by, those who wanted to defend the monasteries and wanted to defend the wealth that was in Ireland, they built these round towers in the landscape with the doors, high up, so that when Vikings invaded up the rivers, they could retreat into the round towers and pull up the ladders. And some of these round towers are still in our landscape around as symbols of that particular phase of resistance. So my understanding of Moore's song was that these were the round towers that he was speaking about, that the fisherman was looking down through the waves of time and kind of remembering in the same way in the first verse as he was reminding people about Malachy winning the collar of gold from the proud invader. I thought that this was his meaning with the round towers of other days. Now, this is where I learned a little bit more when I researched this in terms of Lough Neagh's name and Lough Neagh's origin story. So I was familiar with a myth story about Fionn McCool, and you might be as well, where Fionn McCool, the great Irish, I suppose not a god, but great Irish character, great Irish soldier in Irish myth and legend. In one of his fights, he picks up a sod and he throws it into the ocean after a rival. And, the story goes that when he lifted the sod, that's what formed Lough Neagh. And when he threw the sod into the ocean, it landed and it became the Isle of Man. And of course, they're similar size. The story is a famous myth. And the fact that on the Isle of Man, of course, they speak a language, Manx, which is extremely close to Gaeilge, kind of gives that story a nice kind of a finish. But in researching this, I've come across a deeper meaning for the origin story of Lough Neagh, and it goes back to Lough Neathach. Remember the Ócach or Ócaig, one of the forms of the Dagda. So Caxton wrote a book, this obviously is from the English point of view, called The History of England, Wales and Scotland and Ireland. And he speaks about the lake. He says there is a lake in Ulster, and he talks about how much fish there is, that it's the size of it, that the River Bann runs into it, and that the lake runs out into the North Ocean. But he mentions that this is the quote, there was a well in the lands that great evil was living. And there was a well in these lands, and it was always covered. And if it was left uncovered, the well would rise and drown all of the land. And it happened that a woman went to the well to fetch water. And essentially, she forgot to close that well, and up sprung from underneath the ground a well which continued to rise and rise and rise and drowned the land. And that this was, in his book, his explanation of the origin of the lake. So this appears to be the origin story of Lough Neagh, but told from the point of view of the English who were trying to make sense of the land at the time. The origin story basically is Lough Neathach obviously is named in honour of Ócach. Ócach gets a present of a horse from Angus. The horse fertilises the land in that spot, and from that spot rises up a spring. Now, Ócach builds his house there. He covers the spring with a capstone to stop it from overflowing. But one night the capstone is not replaced, and the spring overflows and drowns Ócach, who the loch is named after, and most of his family, and this creates Lough Neathach. The character Ócach is from the Dagda, as I said earlier, the god of ancient Irish, and sometimes he's known as Ócach Ullachar, meaning horseman or the father of all. Now, this appears to be the real origin story of Lough Neathach. And like I said earlier, the fact that the name has survived colonisation, even though it's in anglicised form, I'm sure you'll agree it's a much better name and much deeper name and much more important name than had Lake Chichester or Lake Sydney supplanted it. Now, it appears to me that this is what Moore is talking about when the fisherman looks down through the lake and sees the round towers of other days. Because there is a myth of drowned cities with ecclesiastical towers, basically, in many different cultures, but especially in many different Celtic cultures, which our language is linked to. So the story around Lough Neagh, Lough Neathach is a story that repeats itself in Welsh culture. Bala Lake in English, Clentegid in Welsh have a similar origin story. And in Brittany, in the city of Ease, YS, there's a lake or a similar story about a drowned city. And of course, in Brittany, you have the language of Breton, which is very closely linked, obviously, to the Celtic languages. It's one of the Celtic languages, so it's like a cousin language of Gaeilge. So if we understand and we think about Lough Neagh, Lough Neathach through its Irish name, and we research the mythical story of the name origin, it leads us not just to have a deeper understanding of Lough Neagh, Lough Neathach, but it also leads us to an understanding of a shared culture and a shared common history between all of these different people, all of these Celtic peoples in Europe. Now, all of this knowledge kind of provides us with a deeper understanding of Lough Neagh, and I'm kind of thinking about Thomas Moore's description, or towards the end of the last verse. The emerald gem of the Western world was set in the crown of a stranger. So when I think about the idea that an Earl of Shaftesbury could legally own the soil and the bedrock of Lough Neagh, Lough Neathach, that's the image that comes to mind to me, this emerald gem of a Western world, Lough Neagh, being set in the crown of a stranger. And the guy, there's kind of a certain irony that at the time that Lough Neagh, Lough Neathach, which is technically in his ownership, is, dying and suffering, the guy is appearing in, the English home, immediate English home, and he's unveiling, a grade 1 listed St. Giles house and estate in Dorset. So he's after redeveloping the family ancestral home at this time. And he's appearing in these aristocratic publications showing off the wealth that exists within that home. He's after rebuilding, repurposing, and bringing back to life. And this is occurring, at the same time that this emerald gem, this, special place, both in terms of myth, both in terms of history, and in terms of a landscape, and in terms of importance to our everyday life in Ireland. This is occurring at the same time that the lake is dying on its feet. Now, coming back to the original stories at the very start, the lake dying and what's said in the media and what's probably omitted, I kind of explored a little bit of the history which was omitted, and it gives us hopefully a deeper understanding. But there are things of great relevance which tend to be either omitted completely or pushed way down the list of priorities or the list of importance, which are contributing massively to the crisis at Lough Neagh. So in most reports, farming will be mentioned, obviously, and general pollution. But things that are omitted or downplayed are really, really important and very, very relevant to our podcast and our story today. The loch's ownership, or the lake's ownership, by the Earl of Shaftesbury, the 12th Earl of Shaftesbury, as it turns out, it has implications for planned changes, any changes, because the loch is used as a sewage outfall, and this arrangement is only permissible through Crown immunity. Crown immunity. So, in other words, the law that says that the Crown is immune from prosecution for, in this case, wastewater, in this case, pollution, direct pollution to Lough Neagh or Lough Neathach. The other thing that is downplayed or not necessarily given the billing that it should be is that there is about 1.5 million tons of sand dredged from Lough Neagh every year. And this sand obviously is used in construction and other things. Incidentally, the sand was used to construct stormont buildings, at a time when, it was very much a sectarian parliament and a sectarian state. But every year on year, the Shaftesbury estate will have been getting royalties from this sand extraction. And while we don't have the figures, obviously, today for how much royalties the Shaftesbury estate earns from this, figures released in the kind of 60s and 70s would indicate that it's pretty substantial. So what we see is we've got a contrast of things happening here. We have the Earl of Shaftesbury restoring his ancestral home, the grade 1 listed aristocratic home at a time when he maybe not personally, but he's benefiting, his estate is benefiting from the extraction of a resource in Ireland, which is causing massive ecological pollution to one of Ireland's most famous, I suppose, landscape features and one of Ireland's most important resources. So how does all of this help us with understanding Lough Neagh, this story today? Well, it seems to me that we're dealing with two different philosophies, and most media coverage is somewhere in between, although probably a little bit more to one side or one understanding. So on one hand, we've got the colonial inspired understanding of places like Lough Neagh and features and resources like those, where they're seen as property of someone, of a person, and they're seen as places to extract from, places to capitalize from, places to profit from. On the other hand, we've got kind of a much older or deeper understanding of landscape features. There's the real history, the true history with them, and there's the myth that goes with them. And the myth often is rooted in almost a religious-like understanding of that place. And in this understanding, it places the mountain or the valley or the lake, the loch in this case, on a higher plane, and kind of an understanding that it's owned by everybody and nobody, and that the importance of the lake is that it has to be respected. In this case, the lake could be a river, it could be a mountain, that it's to be respected because, yes, there's an understanding that there's a give and take, that it gives to you or that you take from it and it gives to you, but that you have a kind of a responsibility to preserve it and respect it. And that's the kind of reason for the myth stories that go with it, so that people have attach an importance to it or a deeper meaning to it. And if we have this understanding of places like Lough Neagh, and that trumps the other kind of philosophy of extraction, of utilizing it for profit and benefit alone, then environmental disasters as they are won't happen. I'm also kind of struck by the solutions that are put forward. So some of the solutions, as I mentioned earlier, were that water charges would be introduced on the ordinary population of the north. A neoliberal solution, the only solution that we can come up with to this crisis of a capitalist system is that more, ordinary people pay more charges. And this only makes sense, again, if you take away the idea that it's profit-driven enterprises that are causing the environmental crisis. Another solution, of course, is the Earl of Shaftesbury putting forward the idea that he'd be happy to sell the lake, to sell Lough Neagh, that essentially he's looking for compensation to hand it over for it to be fixed. Again, we're dealing with two different philosophies here, but it seems absurd and it seems a little bit crazy, to be honest with you. And Mar Uckle score on this one, one of the things that guided us through this podcast was Thomas Moore's Let Erin Remember. And the concept that I was using there is using a song rather than like a textbook, which, you've got with a song, you've got a ready to go couple of verses, small bit of writing, a small bit of lyrics, but it can be extremely powerful and convey an extremely powerful message. My understanding or my thinking of all of this comes back to the idea that the Earl of Shaftesbury can own the bottom of the lake. That is kind of like the source of all of the thinking that has brought Lough Neagh to the place that it is today. And Ewan MacColl has a very, very good song, The Manchester Rambler, which although it's about mountains and although it's about mountains in England, the idea comes through and applies to this particular situation as well. In the last verse, he says, he's quoting obviously the guy that is trying to stop him from trespassing in inverted commas on the mountain, which he's rambling on. And the guy says, all this land is my master's. And Ewan MacColl says, at that I stood shaking my head. No man has the right to own mountains any more than the deep ocean bed. And I think you can add to that the idea that one person could own a lake. I think it's as crazy as any idea that you could ever hear. So Shin Shin a Kharja, Shin A, that is episode number 2. That is the second one in the can. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's brought you a little bit of deeper understanding of an aspect of Irish history. In this case, in the first episode, we looked at specifically and overtly at language And today we looked at a geographical feature in Ireland, Lough Neathach, Lough Neagh. And I hope that you being in my company in the last 20 minutes or so, that you've taken enjoyment, entertainment from it, and maybe that you've learned a bit, and maybe you have sparked ideas in your head as well about something similar, or that you can apply this analysis to something else. If you have enjoyed it, please share it with someone that may also enjoy it, may also have an interest in these particular type of things. And thank you for being with me. And hopefully episode 3 will be in your possession as soon as possible. So Kharja Gurv Mila Mahagut Sucht Velum. Thank you so much for being with me. Gurv Mila Mahagut Slán Gafóla Kharja.